Welcome to Georgetown and to this event organised by CERES of the School of Foreign Service. We're delighted to have with us Senator Mircea Geoana, a distinguished Romanian politician. He was appointed in 1996 the Romanian ambassador to the United States and served for 4 years. And then in 2000, he was made the Romanian foreign minister and occupied that position for 4 years. Between 2008 and 2011, he was president of the Romanian Senate, and in 2009, he was the candidate of the Social Democratic Party, the largest political party in Romania, for the presidency of Romania. He narrowly failed in the runoff to win the presidency. He may regard that as a blessing in disguise, I don't know. But he has gone on to pursue a distinguished career as a roving ambassador in a way for Romania while remaining a member of the Senate. He's going to talk to us this evening on the relative decline of the West and the rise of the rest. I think he's particularly well suited to talk on that subject because since I've known him, which is a number of years now, he's been a firm advocate of Romania's integration into NATO and the European Union. So I'll pass the microphone over to Senator Geoana.
Thank you, Professor Delat and Dennis. It's a privilege it's like a campaign. I have so much light on myself. Politics is a virus. When I was just a diplomat, and I want to recognize also Stella here, the Chargé d'Affaires of Romania here, and all of you. My first observation after many long years in public service, in diplomacy, international affairs. In 2001, I also ran the OSCE for 1 year, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, encompassing some 55 countries, all the way from Central Asia, including Russia, all the way to US and Canada. And I remember at that time I was dealing together with George Robertson, the Secretary General of NATO, and Javier Solana, whom you probably know, at that time the head of the EU foreign policy, the fantastic crisis in Macedonia, which is on the brink of disintegration. But to tell you the truth, the moment when communists collapsed in 1989, and tomorrow, my dear younger friends, some of you, unfortunately for me, much younger friends than I am, will be having a quarter of a century, 25 years since the fall of communism. And many people, especially in the West, but probably in the rest as well, were thinking not only that this was the end of history, but this would be a triumph, a liberal democracy and capitalism, the Western style. Probably the American style, but I would put it more broadly, the Western style. But if you look at the numbers and the evolutions, every success, every triumph, because the fall of communism was a triumph of the West, of America, but also the Western allies of America. A huge success always triggers change. And in the first part of the post-triumph world, the post-1989 world, the post-1991, which is the dissolution of former Soviet Union, and also the beginning of the dissolution in Yugoslavia, everybody believed that this will be another American century, that Pax Americana will become the norm, and the societal model inspired from long centuries of enlightenment, of freedoms, of liberal democracy and capitalism will become the name of the game around the world. But there's always a problem who triumphs. That the moment you become so successful, the recipe for success becomes a commodity. And the moment former communist countries like China, or even Russia, or countries that were lagging behind dramatically, discovered the recipe of free markets and started to benefit from the globalized economy, you start having a significant problem that today the West is faced with. I would encourage you to look at the numbers in terms of economic growth. Let's say China versus the US and European Union. With a clear expectation for China to continue to rise, and for Asia to continue to rise, and for Eurasia to continue to rise, and for Latin America to continue to rise, and yes, Africa to start rising, which is probably one of the best news for our planet and for the huge unfairness that was applied to this continent. There will be the rise of the rest. Will the West be able to keep, maintain, and influence global world affairs like the West has been doing for the last few hundred years? That's the big question mark. There are lots of theories, and I would like to make you a small journey among the thinkers and the pundits and the intellectuals and academia and professional politicians and strategists. There is a theory which is mainly the theory of the economists, that of course, like all economists, like to crunch numbers and look in long economic and business cycle terms, which is absolutely normal. If you take the mere rate of growth of GDP, it is an absolute normalcy to see China in the next 10, 15, 20 years, despite the hiccups that they will probably have in the maturization of their economy and society, take over in terms of nominal GDP the US and probably Europe. Today, the EU and the US have roughly the same amount of GDP each. America is roughly 13,000 billion, and the EU is by and large there. China is roughly 11 at this point in time. So with the rate of growth, even slower rate of growth that China is expecting, we might be seeing China overcoming the US and European Union in the next 10, 15, 20 years, 25 years, but in a foreseeable future nonetheless. But there are economists that are not measuring only GDP as an economic indicator, and they're trying to define something which is something I believe is much closer to what you young students of foreign policy, international affairs, and global affairs should be looking at, which is economic power. Economic power is different as a notion from mere GDP. And there are lots of people trying to combine indicators to try to reflect what's the real economic power of a nation, and in the point in case, which is in fact the real power of the Chinese economy with respect to the American, Japanese, Korean, Indian, European Union economies. They even invented and created a specific indicator which is a combination between, of course, GDP, you have to take that into account, productivity, which you have to take into account, but also the rate of growth that you also have to take into account. If you combine these factors, you'll be finding that in terms of economic power, the US had its peak in year 2000, when America reached its highest points of economic power in terms of the three factors I mentioned: GDP, productivity, and rate of growth of the GDP. At that point, the European Union was doing, even in terms of the GDP, was close to the US. In terms of economic power, these three indicators, which is a multiplier between these three indicators, was somewhere around 70% of the economic power of the US. And China was somewhere around 20-something percent of the economic power of the US in 2000. In 2010, something interesting happened. The US has declined from 100%, which is the point of reference in 2000, the maximum, the peak of economic power of the US, to 74% of the economic power of the US in 2000, so a 24% decline of American power, economic power. We have seen a similar decline to 54% of the American power of the EU, even sharper than in the US, and we have seen a rise of China's economic power to roughly 30% of the economic power of the US. There is a theory of convergence in economics that usually says that the follower, which naturally has higher rates of growth, is catching up. It's a catching up theory, convergence theory. But this theory also has the growth ceiling. There is a level which economists believe to be around 80% of the power of the leader, in this case in point America, and there is a limit, a glass ceiling that you touch, you hit, and you cannot go and overpass the leader just because you're an imitator of the recipe of the leader. I don't know if this will be the case or not, but I would like to tell you that even if China will be in the position to be the greatest, the largest economy in the world, which is inevitable, this will take place in 15 or 30 years, it's irrelevant in historical terms. This will be the #1 economy in the world. But in terms of economic power, probably China and other big economies will have to wait before they overpass the American economic power and even European Union economic power. To give you an example and to have the rest of the large contenders for supremacy in the world, speaking of multipolar world, India today is only 7% of the American economic power. Latin America as a whole is 7% of the American economic power. And this is probably will take a little more time. Japan is 15% of the American economic power. And Korea, which is a phenomenon in terms of moving up, a country coming from behind, is where somewhere around 9% of the economic power of the US. So to give you my personal observations, what is making a nation become a hegemon, a leader, a dominant leader, a global player? There is a combination of a few factors that people at Georgetown and people like you learning about the politics of power and all the components of power should be naturally students of. I see 6 factors that are affecting the capacity of one nation to become a global leader and to stay on as a global leader, which is the conversation of our conference tonight. The first one is, of course, the economic competitiveness of a country. Don't look only to the sheer numbers, look at the quality of growth. There are 3 models of growth. One is the commercial growth. Let's say, the case of Romania. We try to be on the new Silk Road, which now reconnects China across Central Asia, the Caucasus, across the Black Sea, to Europe. And this is happening as we speak. As we speak. The Polish railroad signed an agreement with the Chinese and Russian railroads. And as we speak, starting last month, there's a weekly transportation by rail from China to Poland, and there are everyday transportation to Warsaw, and there are everyday cargo coming by rail from China to Lodz and to other Polish cities. Hewlett-Packard, HP, is exporting its whole production in Western China to Rotterdam by rail, because by rail you make only 2 weeks, and by ocean, by seas, you make 5 weeks, all the way towards Rotterdam, which is a big global port. HP, it's exporting its whole production in Western China by rail. So these kind of commercial routes, this was the example I was making, are just part of the one category of growth, which is commercial growth. You find a new road route, a new commercial route, and you grow around that route. There is, of course, the infrastructure, the hardware of an economy, which is another engine of growth, which is important. And here, America lags behind tremendously. Despite the shale gas revolution, which is a game changer, and it's a fantastic dynamo that will affect positively the American economy, for the rest of the infrastructures, America is lagging behind. Electricity grids, highways, ports, airports. And this is something that America has to address if they want to really keep another big engine of growth, which is infrastructure and hardware, long-term hardware of the economy. You cannot grow without that. But the most important element of growth, and this is where the differential will continue to be made in terms of who's going to be the dominating economy and culture and ideology on this earth in the 21st century, is innovation, innovative, human capital, research, universities, connection between private sector and academia. Because the number one struggle in the 21st century, my young friends, and this is not a threatening finger pointed at you, it's an encouragement for you, will be the quest for talent. Will not be a quest for resources that much. Will not even be a competition for innovation, which is, of course, a very important thing. Will be a search for talent. The revolution in communication and IT, the 3D printing, will change the nature of work. Corporations will not be as they are today, hierarchies, having hundreds of thousands. The big, large transnationals have hundreds of thousands of employees, the Siemenses of the world and the IBMs of the world and the HPs of the world, many of them in my country, Romania. Tens of thousands of bright IT and software engineers are employed in my country. The second spoken language after English in Seattle, Microsoft, is Romanian, and third is some form of Indian, one dialect of the number of languages spoken in India. The quest for talent will be the number one thing, and this will be a driver for change, which is immense. So if you look at this situation, it's not abnormal for the Chinese leadership that will be finishing tomorrow on Tuesday a very important leadership meeting of the Communist Party with a new president, a new prime minister, that people describe, and you read this in the newspapers, as important and as the 1978 Deng Xiaoping decision to move China from its Maoist past towards openness and capitalism. And this is the second dimension I would like to talk about, which will be influencing the game of the global affairs. The number one, it's economics and economic power, which is defined in a very sketchy way. I was trying to lure you into the readings on these things, and if you want, I can give you some interesting texts that were written in this respect. The second one is basically what we call the model of economic organization of a nation, and the question is what kind of capitalism will have the upper hand in the end. In the West, we are tempted to believe that the Western-style capitalism, which is not a single model of capitalism. There is an Anglo-Saxon version of capitalism, which traditionally is called laissez-faire capitalism, where you believe, and people believe, that allocation of capital should be done as freely as possible, with the less intervention from the government as possible, and basically the invisible hand will be making sure that in the end, the best investment and return on investment will be done by the markets. There is another model which is the heart of Europe, Germany, France, Italy, which is called the social market capitalism. Even the center-right in Germany, Chancellor Kohl and now Chancellor Merkel, are explicitly speaking, the conservatives in Germany, they speak about social market economy, where the balance is not much in favor of capital, but on the social balance inside the society, on education and healthcare and social protection, which people can say that is more cumbersome and more expensive, but also takes care of the human capital of those societies. So this is what we call the Rhine-style capitalism, which is something that is very important in most of Europe, including in some of the newcomers into the EU, like my country, or Bulgaria, or Hungary, or Poland, or the Baltic countries, and everybody in between. But there is another model of capitalism which is improved and is becoming more efficient, which is called the managed capitalism, or some people call it state-managed capitalism, that China applies. And Russia applies to us in a certain way. And this will be the big clash for the commanding heights of the world in the 21st century, my dear friends. Because there is a seduction for this more authoritative kind of leadership, which sacrifices freedoms on the one hand, but emphasizes efficiency on the other hand. And also one has to recognize, and this is sometimes the myopia that we see in the West, that we believe that our values, which are Judeo-Christian values, are the only values around the world. They are not. It's a major version of the values of humanity, but it's not the only one, because Confucius and the other people that praise a different set of values, where eventual less individual freedom on the order of community good and less individual freedom on the order of economic efficiency is something that could eventually become a competitor for the version of value-based capitalism that we try to present as being universal in the West. The big question is, are these values universal that we believe in the West? I believe these are true for everybody. But will be a citizen of Korea, of China, of Indonesia, of Malaysia, or Argentina, or India, consider that these values, this type of capitalism that we profess, and sometimes we try to basically present as the universal mantra, is the one that will be acceptable and accepted by the citizens of the rest? That's a question that we don't know the answer about yet. But I believe this will be a major competition on the realm of what type of capitalism and which will be the most efficient one. And this is something that is a work in process. I personally believe, looking to my previous point, that talent hunting, brain hunting, will be the #1 competition in the 21st centuries and the centuries to come, if we'll still be able to occupy and populate this planet, if we don't destroy it in between, is that probably in open societies, talent tends to thrive more. Because I can give to a scientist in a less democratic society the same conditions, let's say like on the best Berkeley labs, to give you an example. But would that person feel only the need to have the tools for his profession, or would he need also a sense of freedom and democracy and a good and nice job for his or her wife, and a decent future for their kids, and not to be at risk of being basically subject to decisions by authoritarian governments? I don't know. I don't know. But I tell you that this will be one of the major decisive factors on the race to the bottom, who's going to be the commanding height in the 21st century. Thirdly, it's obviously a problem of human capital. The ones who will be able to have educated people, the ones who will be able to teach their populations the skills of living in ever and faster changing conditions, the ones who have a system of education that will be also ready to accept that change will be the norm and not the exception, will be the countries and the nations and the ideologies that will be the winning ones in the 21st and the other centuries to come. Because it's obvious to all of us, I think, that you just cannot thrive if you don't invest in your people. And here I have to say, looking at the scores, fantastic score that South Korean high schools are making, the best in the world, you see numbers also in American universities from Asian students that are impressive. We'll have to see which will be winning the race for the best trained human capital and populace. And this is a growing concern in many countries. Fourthly, would be, of course, a problem of military might. In the end, irrespective how strong you are economically, there is a crunch time where military force, credible military force, is a factor of assessing who's going to be in the top position in the 21st century. Of course, here America has a fantastic leading edge. It invests a lot. There are theories like Paul Kennedy's that says that imperial overstretch, that investing too much on defense instead of investing in the other infrastructures and human capital could lead to the decline of a major superpower like the US. There are some people believing that this is not the dominant factor. But the ones who will be able to possess and deter credibly the challenges of the 21st century, where there will be more outer space that we know today, there will be more robotic warriors that we believe today, there will be technology-intensive industries that we believe today. And here I believe that still the US has a leading edge that will be difficult to be caught with by other players, but this is not impossible. But this is something that you have to keep in mind, not as a decisive factor, but one of the key factors to global leadership and global power. There is also something about the capacity of political institutions to cope with governance, what we call the governance gap. And this is the fifth factor that will make a distinction between today and tomorrow's global leaders. Because a political system is made of institutions. Institutions are either conducive to rational and positive decision-making process where allocation of resources and public policies are made in a rational way towards the common good and, of course, the advantage of that nation. Or you have gridlock, and the governance gap will be increasing all over the world. All over the world. Number one, because the world is changing so fast, because power as we knew it is changing dramatically, what people call the diffusion of power. Give you example, the appearance of global non-state actors like corporations and NGOs. In order to be a politician today in the US, or in Germany, or in Romania, or in China, there are also politicians everywhere, you'll have to face growing difficulties to cope with a world which is changing so dramatically that the instruments of governance are lagging behind. They were lagging behind before, but today they are lagging behind in a dramatic way. And the political institutions that will be able in the 21st century to cope with dramatic changes, most of the time traumatic changes. And the most important change in the 21st century, in my opinion, would not be the continuation of the technological and internet and 3D and all these technology-driven changes, which will be tremendously intense and will bring change at a pace which was never seen before. I read a piece 2 months ago in the New York Times when the Voyager, the space vehicle, which there are two of them, Voyager 1 and 2, launched in the 1970s, I believe. And one of those managed to go for the first time beyond the solar system. Beyond the solar system. they traveled something like 76 billion miles since 1976 up to 2013. It was funny, they put something on YouTube and you could see the noises, the different noises of the space in between solar systems. There was an obvious change of noise in the outer solar system, in between solar systems, than in our solar system. And the guys from NASA had a difficulty because the recording instruments on Voyager, that was 1976 technology, were the level of what I used to have when I was young and were having parties in my generation time, what they call a magnetophone. So basically, you know, those tapes like this, and it was a 6-track recorder like that. And it was so much information on that one that is basically the cheapest, not a smartphone, the cheapest phone you can find with $0 in the corner has more power than that tool that was used in the 1970s. And they had to call the smart guys from NASA, an old team from NASA that used to work in the 1970s. And you know, they come like this, old. And the poor old guys say, listen, we are so ashamed in coming there, so many bright people, our days are gone. But they're the only ones who are able to conduct from Earth the erasure of some data on the 6-track tool on Voyager to be able to make more room for more evidence to be recorded. So what I'm just trying to say with this anecdote, that the distance between 1976 and 2013, in terms of power of technology, will be something that will be changed probably in every other year and probably will be every other 6 months. This is the exponential evolution of technology. And I say this because this is not the driving force for change in the 21st century. The true driving change in the 21st century that also be impacting global affairs and global power and the shift of global power will be the future of human sciences, will be the future of biotechnology, the future of genomics, the future of what we know as anything that has to do with our own destiny, and the human being and the scientists of today and of tomorrow, and also in your generation, will be taking control for the first time in the history of the human species on the evolution of our species and on evolution on Earth. This is the most fundamental shift in the history of human mankind. As Al Gore puts in his recent book, which is a great book, by the way, The Future, at this point in time, human beings start to play God. And when you start to play God, the consequences of such changes are so intense and bring so many changes from the ethical dimension. How, when, and if should I clone human beings? What will be the impact for social securities and retirement if we will be in the position to live 120 or 30 or 40 years, which is not impossible, and this will probably take place relatively soon. Which will be the impact on tax collection? Which will be the impact on governance? Which will be the possibility of politics and governments to cope with this kind of challenges, which are challenges which were never heard before. We have a recollection of how to wage war, how to reconstruct, how to fight diseases and infections, how to really fight against poverty and famine. But we never were, and governments are already poorly equipped to cope with the current situation. I'm thinking with grave concern to the total incapacity of governments in the most performant countries, not to speak of the poorer ones, poor governance ones, to cope with this kind of challenges. This will put a governance gap which will be immense. Who's going to be able to cope with that? This is a factor that has to be taken into account. And some people say that liberal democracies and I continue to believe the liberal democracies are the ones who are best equipped to cope with these changes, but we might be in the position the liberal democracy will not be that equipped to cope with this kind of more dramatic and traumatic differences between human beings. I can live because I have money, you die because you don't have money. We accept social differences. We accept, like in India, the castes. They accept that you see huge palaces and the most tremendous misery coexisting, and they're basically absolutely no barriers because there's an acceptance in that society. This is something that is very, very important and has to be kept in mind. And lastly, is what I believe is the most important thing in the end, which is who's going to be commanding the realm of ideas, ideals, and models. Who's going to be the most seductive civilization? Who's going to be the most seductive civilization? Because it's not enough to have economic power. It's not enough to have technological capabilities. It's not enough to have good economic, good governance or military might, or to have a political system that can cope with change. But have something else, which is something that that's how we are built. The power of ideas and values. And I have to say that even today, probably the West has a more seductive story to tell. I do not know in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, 1 century from now, where this thing will lead us in terms of who's going to be the center of seduction on this planet. Or could be on another planet, who knows? Because we might be in the position to leave this planet if we don't take care of it, because it's in grave, grave danger, by the way. Which will be the outcome from this competition? Here, opinions vary a lot. There are some people that believe that between the US and China, and between the West and the rest, we could find a sort of a negotiated compromise, engineering the new world order by design. And I think this would be the preferable path to follow. Because the growth of the others and the fact that the ones who are becoming stronger and richer and mightier, they ask a place at the table. This is exactly like the table here with one boy and 3 wonderful ladies. But there's some empty seats. Until a number of years ago, it was G7, a group of 7 countries. And then Russia was co-opted mainly for political reasons, not because they had the economy to compare with the 7 largest Western economies. I include Japan in the Western economies, by the way. Australia, I include Australia in the Western economies, by the way, because of the model, which is a Western model in a sense. And now we move to G20, and irrespective how ineffective the G20 format is, it's a recognition of the world which is changing. But this is not enough, because look today, the world governance, the world system of governance is basically antiquated. It's after the Second World War. The UN is built like this. The Security Council is built like this. The IMF is built like this. The World Bank is built like this. And it's no surprise to should not be a surprise to anybody that if the Chinese financing of other economies is creating an alternative World Bank. Because China says, listen, I am not in the position to call the shots. The US and the West are calling the shots in the World Bank. I should really try to make my own policies. And you see the Chinese Development Bank and the Chinese banks, with all their difficulties, because they have difficulties behind, investing aggressively in Africa. You know what they've been financing, the Chinese banks, lately? A railroad which is parallel to the Panama Canal. Why? Because they want to make sure they don't depend on the control of the Panama Canal that the US continues to have with all the independence of Panama and the control of the Panama to the government of Panama. Why has China purchased, during the Greek crisis, the tremendously strategic port of Piraeus in Greece? Because that's a must-have position in world commerce. Why has China purchased, at the cost of crisis, sales, Veterans Day sales, the ports in Spain? Because they're vital for the railroad, in parallel with the Panama Canal, for them to ship merchandise from across the Atlantic. This is something that is absolutely normal. But this is something that tells all of us that it's a natural request from the rest to be co-opted in the design of the new world order. And this is very difficult for the ones who have the control today, which is the West, to give that control away. Do you see France or the UK accepting somebody else from Europe on the Security Council as permanent members? Not that easily, with all the European Union supranational dimension, which is again a great experiment that I convinced has not said its last word. The second option for this new world organizing the world with the rise of the rest is through the traditional means of competition and even war. This will be two types of risks. One is a new Cold War between the US and China mainly. And the reappearance, if it's a Cold War, this will be containment. I was seeing Henry Kissinger the other day in New York. He received an award of the Aspen Institute. He was introduced by Madeleine Albright. You know her well she's at Georgetown. We used to work together. And somebody from the crowd was asking Henry Kissinger, who was the architect of the rapprochement between the US and China to contain Soviet Union at that time, what would be your position? Do you think that the West will be reaching out to Russia to counterbalance China in the 21st century? Just the opposite of what we did in the 20th century. And Romania played a small role in the rapprochement between China and the US at that time. If there will be a Cold War type, it means that we'll have lots of proxy wars at the periphery between the smaller players. Because there will be competition also for resources, not only for global competition. The nexus of energy, food, and water. By 2030, the need for the 8.2 billion inhabitants of this planet for water will increase by 35%, for food for 40%, and for energy with 50%. This will mean the scarcity of resources, which will be amplified by the competition between global players and smaller proxies of the bigger players, will be so intense that we could really see tremendous tension around the world. We can also see something that could be probably one of the better solutions, still risky, but better than the second option, which will be basically a diversity of political systems and a competition between different variants of organization of societies. So by and large, the West and the ones who are influenced by the West will be continuing to work more or less by the same norms and rules, liberal democracies, and one of the two versions of capitalism, laissez-faire or something more strategic or more social. But one could really see the appearance of a different type of capitalism and organization that will not be leading necessarily to the dislocation of the US as the #1 player in the world, but will basically a coexisting of multiple worlds, a coexistence of multiple worlds. And this is something that is not impossible to take place, because the illusion after the fall of communism that everybody will follow the model of capitalism and democracy that the West and the US were the beneficiaries of, and also were the explanation of the huge success of the West, is just an illusion. You cannot change cultures that much. You cannot change the reflection of history in the brains of human beings and collective brains of nations. You cannot do that. So there will be a natural pride, in a way, for countries that are coming from other corners of the world to basically have a legitimate desire to build their own versions of capitalism and societies. How this multiple, not only multipolar world, but multiple variants of the world will coexist, and how would this lead to global governance? This is something that we'll all have to keep in mind, but this will be a tremendous evolution. And the last, I knock on wood in various rhythms, Asian, African, and whatever you name it, but I knock on wood, is basically genie out of the bottle. Because such a tremendous shift, which has never been before, in such a condensed period of historical time, could also lead to a world which is basically ungovernable at the global level. This is not impossible. I believe this is the lowest risk from all the versions I tried to present to you, but this is not impossible for the world to really go crazy. And this incapacity of political institutions around the world this time to cope with the changes that will take place everywhere could really lead to such a dissatisfaction in the populace of the world that not even the most controlled Chinese Communist Party will be in the position, and this gradualistic approach and what they try to do to make sure that the transformation takes into account the culture of the country and also the desire not to go too abruptly into changes, will be contested, because there will be a global middle class, and the individual empowerment made by science and technology will make citizens and the global middle class, which will be very large, in face of an option of three political alternatives, ideologically speaking. One is that a more traditional way, middle-of-the-road politics, which is center-left, center-right, basically, as we call it in the West, but it's mainstream politics that will continue to be attractive for the rational part of the population of the world, especially in the West, but in other countries. There'll be also radicalism that will grow. In times of change, in times of frustration, because this tremendous change, these mega trends of change, will be bringing so much havoc and so much inadaptation. You, because you're attending great schools and you're bright kids, you'll be winners in any situation. You'll be doing okay. I can see it from your eyes, from your body language. You'll be okay. But lots of others will not be okay. There will be lots of others that will have difficulty to adapt to their jobs and professions to these dramatically and traumatically changing circumstances. And this is room for radical, populistic. Look at Europe today. If you have a little bit of historical sense of Europe, Professor Dilettant, this is very worrisome. This hate against immigrants, this hate against other races, the appearance of political parties in France today, the number one party is Le Front National, the extreme right party, the first political party in France today. They will be winning European elections in May next year, in the first time in the history of the Republic of France. I'm seeing in the Netherlands the founders of modern capitalism, before the Brits and before the Americans. I see some fringes of populists that are really troublesome. If I would be a Jew, I'm not, I will be very concerned because my historical brain my radar will be detecting me some waves like this traumatized nation and people have been seeing over history. So radicalism and populism will be again a major risk. And the other one, which is the largest risk of all, is the fact that disruptive technologies, not nuclear weapons like Iran tries to acquire, disruptive technologies that will be at disposition of individuals and small groups and quasi-terrorist organizations will be basically on the shelf at Duane Reade or Staples or Huang what will be the name of the Chinese version of Staples in the 21st century. I'm improvising now. So disruptive technologies in hands of disgruntled representatives of the have-nots of the 8.2 billion inhabitants of the world in 2030 could really present a major risk to global stability. Because once you find out, and NSA can find out where the attack was originated from, the natural reaction of a national government is to retaliate against the state which harbored that kind of disruptive attack, like we have seen in Afghanistan. And we still sense the consequences of Afghanistan. So this is something that has to be kept in mind, that in the 21st century, there will be huge opportunities for human development and prosperity and peace and harmony, but also be tremendous risks and challenges to global security, to peace and decency in the world. Which will be the winner, the West or the rest? I think the rest is not yet capable to put all the ingredients together to dominate the world. I do not believe that Europe, which is now in a relatively bad shape, has said its last word in global affairs, even if we are in European Union crossing a very difficult time. We have to basically opt towards going forward to a more supranational Europe, but with less countries willing to join the project, or be going to a much looser union that could eventually reach out even to Turkey and to become, as the Brits would prefer, mainly an economic and commercial single market. Will Europe become more of a German type of Europe? Probably not, even if Germany will continue to be the #1 player in the EU. There was a great piece in The Economist of this weekend about the UK, which is a critically important country, which is, the call is, and also the graphic is nice, assigned to the left, Great Britain, and assigned to the right, Little England, speaking of the Scottish referendum for independence and also the referendum to leave the European Union in 2017 or earlier, which could really create for Europe, and I think for America, a tremendous problem, because the UK is one of the, not as influential as it used to be, but is still a relatively junior global player, if my improvisation is correct, and I'm not too arrogant, Professor Dilettant. But I believe that Britain and Europe need to continue together, because if we start to really piecemealing Europe, at that time things will be far more difficult. Who's going to be the winner of this competition? It's clear that the West cannot retain the dominance that it enjoys today. But it's also clear that the others, the rest, don't have all the ingredients to replace America and the West. Because replacing America and the West requires much more than GDP growth, much more than just economic and scientific progress, much more than military might that still needs to be acquired, but needs to have that inspiration, that soft dimension of power that today is missing from the proposition that the West is making to the world. So probably coexistence between multiple worlds, multiple versions of modernity, multiple versions of society arrangements, multiple variants of ideologies, multiple variants, diversity, because in fact that's what we are. Where would be smaller countries into this game, where those countries will choose to be. Not in which camp, but on which side of the barricade between the losers and the winners of this new form of global realignment. There is a theory of national equal opportunity, which I believe in very strongly. There will be countries that will be in the position to use their geography smarter than others. This is what some people call pivot states. Romania could be a pivot state. Turkey is a pivot state. Basically being part of an economic system, but open enough to work with other economic systems and commercial blocs. So benefiting from both. Romania today, my country, is a country at the periphery of the West. Physical periphery of the West, because we are the last frontier of the West. Beyond us, it's non-EU, non-NATO to the east, and a little bit in the Balkans. But we're also the periphery in terms of irrigation with capital, with technology, with investment. It would be a stupid thing for Romania to be a gateway between the East and the West. As I believe it will be a stupid thing for America to pivot alone towards Asia without pivoting together with Europe, towards Eurasia at least. America is a Pacific power. They should be part, and America is part of the Pacific and that part of Asia. But Europe is also a Eurasian power because of the landmass of Eurasia, which is where China is, where India is, what Russia is, where everybody is. And I think it would be a tremendous mistake for Europe and the US, and within NATO for that matter, to diverge. Because if the West will be disunited, then the rest will be rising much faster. And the pretense and the desire of the rest to basically occupy the empty, not only the empty seats, which is their right. To be around the table of decision making is the right of the newcomers. They are working for that, they deserve that, they should be granted that, because that's normal. But they'll also be trying to replace you, the only young man at that table. And then you, and you, and you, and slowly they will try to get the whole Georgetown University with them. I'm joking. And because like any politician, I like when I get a microphone, I have a difficulty with giving it up. I will close it here. I hope this was not too erratic for all of you. But this is an impression from a practitioner of politics and international affairs. Be prepared, buckle up, the world is changing, and only the smart and educated ones, and the talented ones, and the multidisciplinary ones will be in the position to be the net winners of this tremendous race to the bottom. Thank you so much, and I hope you had a wonderful night, and I look forward to your questions.
Yeah, my name is Liu Jun from China. You mentioned China a lot of time. I'm the one from China. Where you said a lot about the new global order. So how about the regional integration, you know? So right now the nation state is a major player in this world. But I think as a small nation like yours, you know, you try to integrate into a regional system, right? And then you become more powerful. And in in different regions of the world, this kind of process is going on, and in terms of the trade, economy. So how would you forecast that kind of regional integration as a pleasure in the future world? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. I think that regional integration will continue, mainly economic one and commercial one, will continue to be a factor. We see this in portions of Africa, we see this in portions of Latin America. We see some attempts in Asia. We see Russia trying to create basically a customs union with some of its former republics, like Kazakhstan or Belarus. We are seeing also the Shanghai Cooperation, an attempt to be doing that, a little bit more than just cooperation. We are seeing APAC. We are seeing, we see lots of forms like this. I also believe that there is a limit to regional integration, because in this multipolar competitive world, there will be also an attempt for the larger powers in one region to coalesce around it countries of smaller dimension to be able to have this regional dimension. So if you look, Nigeria is one country in South Africa. There are countries that are big and influential and have military power. Where I see less chances, speaking of your region, for such regional integration to happen is also because of the huge might of China. And China is such a big player and is continuing to grow that some of its neighbors, I believe, are having some legitimate concerns about the ultimate design of Chinese power. And there will be also a temptation from Japan, from Korea, even from Vietnam and from others, eventually India, to be also playing counterbalancing. Also sometimes the West is interested in creating counterweights to emerging global powers. So in some situations things will go deeper towards regional integration. In other places there will be basically trade but not much integration. I'm praising the European Union model because I believe this is the most interesting experiment in human history in terms of nations that have been fighting wars for centuries to try to work on a common basis. But the rise of China will be creating also concerns in the very region that China is, and will be probably be seeing contradictory tendencies. On the one side, regional cooperation, but on the one side, temptation to balance the rise of China in various forms. Yes, please. They're blinding me with this with these lights.
Hi, my name is Rudy. I'm a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service. My question for you is, how do you see the current demographic shift, the aging of populations in Europe and Japan, and even soon to be in China, as a major obstacle for their continued dominance, or in the case of China, emerging dominance in the global system? And how do you think they'd respond to that?
It's a huge game changer. And you see, probably not for a very long period of time, some younger societies continue to stay young in comparison with more mature societies. You'll be seeing probably the poorer parts of the planet staying younger than the more affluent parts of the planet. But this will be a major problem for governance, not only for economic power as we defined it, because demographics count, GDP counts, everything I told you about really counts. But the real problem is that at a certain moment we'll be reaching a level of incapacity of national governments to cope with such a large old population. And of course there are attempts to go with the retirement age much higher. Look at France. They tried to move it to 62, I think, and it was a huge rage against this, and now they are moving it back, I think, to 59 or something. So this will be a dominant factor of the global shift I was trying to tell you about today. But this is not only in terms of which economy will be more competitive because it's being younger is more productive, but how everybody, including the younger ones today, because in 20, 30 years, you'll be victims of your own success. You'll become more affluent, and at that time, the population will be less tempted to grow exponentially, and the global middle class will tend to be a little bit more reluctant in having too many kids. But my problem with this one is I'm looking at Romania, that in probably 10 years from now, we have more retired people than active labor force today in Romania. I would add to this migration, because migration, international, intra-nations, and like China, is migration to the coast. There's migration to the more affluent parts. I believe also India has similar problems. But I also see migration to the more affluent parts in search for work. In Romania, I have 3 million Romanians that left the country in the last 10 years just because there is freedom of movement in Europe. We have 1.3 million Romanians working in Italy alone as we speak, close to 1 million in Spain. Would they return to the country? Would they stay there? Which would be the demographics, not only the age structure, but also the demographics in general. And the third factor will be urbanization. In 2030, there will be 52% of the world population will live in cities. And I was not mentioning the subnational level of governments in my introduction because large urban conglomerates will be more influential than nation states in many cases. And there will be not only a diffusion of power globally, but will be also a devolution of power internally in countries and nations, individually speaking. So yes, aging, big problem, migration, significant problem, and also the problem of urbanization that will be creating for governance. There's one thing to run a country where the population is in the countryside. There's a different thing to have Ciudad de Mexico with 20-something million people. This would be creating tremendous problems, and also tremendous problems, I have not mentioned this, on the resources, natural resources of the planet that will increase and will create a tremendous pressure and tension and competition for natural resources as well.
Hi, my name is Park. I'm a freshman in SFS who's also aspiring to be a diplomat like yourself.
I used to be one. Now I'm dead and buried as a diplomat. I'm a politician.
Right.
Go ahead. It's a noble profession.
I think so too. My question is, you talked about the model of convergence where the rest catches up to the West in the future. What do you suggest is something that the West can do to maintain its dominance? Do you suggest a state-managed capitalism like China did or Korea in the 1970s? Or do you suggest, like you said, reorganization of the lagging and old-modeled world international organizations? And if you don't want to speak for the entire West, at least for your nation, Romania, which path should those nations take to maintain their dominance?
When I mentioned that 25 years ago, next year, communists collapsed, the so-called Washington Consensus was the norm. And transitional Europe, including my country, were basically transformed from state-controlled economies and lack of democracies into a sort of a Anglo-Saxon model of privatization. And you see many countries, including mine, who have basically given up or destroyed by corruption and poor governance, or were taken away by the more powerful ones, the instruments of economic policy the instruments of economic policy, banking, energy, resources, capital in general. So I do not believe that, number one, there is not one version of capitalism in the West. In Europe, we have 5 different subtypes of capitalism. One is the Rhine capitalism I mentioned in my intervention. One is the Anglo-Saxon one, British, and around that. There is a Scandinavian model of capitalism, more inclusive, but also highly competitive in terms of economic performance. And if you look at competitiveness index, the Scandinavian countries are very, very high up in the hierarchy, in the rankings. You have a Mediterranean, the southern part, which is now so much discussed in the Eurozone, the south. But you also have the former communist countries, including mine, which do represent, even empirically, a sort of a 5th subversion of capitalism, when you have ingredients of egalitarian societies deriving from communism, and the Washington consensus, which is say privatize, privatize, privatize. So it's a sort of a strange hybrid between some of the other models. America is a different model. Canada is different from America. Canada is much closer to Europe in terms of version of capitalism. It's much more social. America has a model of capitalism which derives from the very reasons why people left Europe to escape the kings and persecution. So liberty, freedom, and acceptance of failure is the norm in America, which is not the case in other places. So I do not believe there will be one model of capitalism making headways. What I do believe is that laissez-faire capitalism is about to come to an end. Some people call this strategic capitalism, where basically you retain in the capacity of a government, big or small in size, the capacity to influence, let's say, industrial policy. This was the lessons learned by the Asian economies in 1999 when the first crisis, the first recession erupted, but the West was so smart to give the virus to the Asian economies, to Mexico and to Russia, and to basically stay afloat. This time around it didn't work like this, and it was at the center, at the epicenter of the global capitalism, which is basically the US. What did the Asian economies do? They started to build currencies just not to be weak next time around. They started industrial policies not to be able to import technology and manufactured goods from the outside. They invented, and China is inventing right now, a social security system like healthcare insurance that China doesn't have, at least to my knowledge, as a developed system, and they're trying to build something like this. So in a way, the Asian countries learned something from the crisis of 1999, which will be the response of the West after the Great Recession we are today confronted with, and the implications are still lingering on. Difficult to say. But if I'm looking to one strategic decision that the US has taken, and this is the first big decision, which is to basically exploit its natural resources by fracking and the natural gas revolution around the world, I could say that even the US is moving away from the laissez-faire capitalism and is starting to move, irrespective of Republicans or Democrats. I'm not speaking of ideology here, I'm speaking of sheer economic policies, to a greater role in economic policy. So I believe that the version of capitalism that will be in the position to combine the freedom of entrepreneurs, which brings innovation and talent, but also some form of state and government might to use some economic policy levers, will be the ones who will be the commanding heights, will have the commanding heights. None of the versions is good enough. Managed capitalism has limitations because it stifles competition and innovation, and at a certain moment you allocate resources better, probably, for big projects, but you destroy micro initiatives, which is, I think, is the tissue of competitive nations. So which is the future of capitalism? If America will be smart, they will try to learn something from this crisis, if they're smart. And this is not because you're smart or dumb, because there is always a difficulty in recognizing that you need to change, and change is painful for politicians and populations alike. What will be the case for Romania? We basically didn't have the intellectual capacity to come with a critical and non-mimetical way to look at what kind of capitalism was imposed on us. We were so naive and so inexperienced and so isolated in communist Romania that basically we didn't know which world we were entering in. We are basically confused. And then we have now a hybrid version of capitalism where variants I mentioned about coexist in a very disunited way. I believe that countries like mine that are weak economically need to combine the freedom and the capital markets and everything which makes a young entrepreneur to take the risk to invest in a business or in an enterprise, but also equip ourselves with some instruments of economic policy, mainly in the banking sector or a sovereign fund, or instruments that can make you a player, because if not, you're just naked. A diplomat without the suit, which is sometimes pleasant, sometimes very unpleasant. It depends on the body that everybody possesses. But it's a very good question. Thank you for that one.
We'll take one final question because I believe the reception is waiting for us.
No, I'll be happy. I see also a young colleague here. If we have two, Dennis, can we have two questions?
Yeah, okay.
Because she was trying to get a...
Can we take them together? Perhaps?
Yeah, let's take them together and then I'll respond to both.
Good evening, Senator. Thank you for giving us the talk tonight. My name is Steven, and I'm a freshman at SFS. My question to you tonight is about the foundations of the decline of the West and the rise of, say, China. What do you think are the social, economic, and political institutions that allowed China to rise and continue to rise? And what are the institutions that are perpetuating the decline of the West? Thank you.
Hi, Senator. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us tonight. It was really a fascinating talk. My name's Emma. I'm a sophomore in the SFS. And you mentioned a few times that you don't think that we've heard the last from the great experiment of the European Union. And I'm wondering what you think the prospects are for greater political integration for the European Union. Obviously, we've seen that a well-functioning monetary union may not be possible without greater political and fiscal unity. So I'm wondering if you could just give some comments on that.
Thank you very much. The fact that the Chinese leadership understands that the most successful 30 years of economic growth in the history of human mankind that China has lived through from 1978, with rates of growth that are really impressive. This bonanza of high-level growth cannot continue forever. This is the ceiling I was referring to in terms of catching up, because many economies, young economies, starting from a low-level economies, have the capacity to really grow at a rapid pace for a number of years. But then they get into a moment when they need to change the model of their economy and the drivers of the economy. And also, yes, which is very difficult for the Chinese leadership, I recognize this. Also the political institutions and institutions per se to be able to cope with the next level if you really want to catch up. There are lots of countries that were tigers, Celtic tigers, Asian tigers, all sorts of tigers. When you have seen many of them, and most of them, the only one from what I see, I'm not pretending I'm giving you a final answer, is Korea. that is still able to really go beyond one league to another league to another league in a very interesting way. So the difficult question for the Chinese leadership is how to make the change to the next level of economic growth, which means more efficiency inside the Chinese economy, state-owned enterprises, banks, allocation of resources, which is the impact of the social change as more rural population will be migrating towards cities, which will be the demographics of China, which will be the lessons learned from the American experience. And I'm convinced that the Chinese leadership says, I cannot continue to buy US T-bills. I have to diversify as well. But which will be the decision of the Chinese leadership, I think will continue to be gradualistic. I don't think they have the luxury or the culture to have so much disruption. Will the decisions be as historical as the ones in 1978, the ones that will be taken over this weekend? This is one of the most significant political conversations in the world today, is what really happens in Beijing and which will be the model of economic growth, political evolution and institution change in this large country of the world. I'm a little bit less optimistic that can find the magic bullet to make them move forward and I think that China will have a difficulty in continuing to rise that fast without looking much deeper into that system. This is why China will not become, and the renminbi will not become the global currency reserve, because they don't have enough openness in the markets. I would not trust to use that currency if the government one day has a conclave and they decide to do something else. So there is a long way to replace America as the global player that have all these ingredients together, including military and including technological and so on and so forth. But it is the merit of the Chinese leadership that they are understanding the complexities of the problems and trying to find solutions, and this is a rational way to approach things. Europe, our dear subject here. On the one hand, it was probably impossible for the European project to continue on its political integration without more economic and fiscal integration. And what I see in Europe are basically two tendencies. A tendency at the center of Europe to have more integration and try to have a compromise between Germany and France and North and South for a middle of the road, for the conditions which will make the Euro and the Eurozone a highly integrated political and economic zone. But I also see centrifugal tendencies in Europe, and I think there is a tremendous risk for multiple Europes to happen. More or less what the UK wants, to have basically a single market and all the advantages of this huge market of 500 million consumers, but also to have various sub-segments of Europe, which I believe will be very difficult to cope with. What I believe will happen will be probably a multiple speed Europe. I see a growing asymmetry between Germany and France. Germany is growing, but also Germany is growing older than France. France is the youngest country in the developed European Union countries because of immigration and the population which is growing fast. So what will be the rest of Europe? Because there will be also hardcore Europe and the rest of Europe, including my country. I would say that this is very much depends on our economic strength. If we're in the position to join the political club of a more integrated Europe, I think we should go there. But if we are unprepared as we are today, and weak economically as we are today, joining the euro and joining and giving up national sovereignty before we get stronger will be very difficult for us to cope with. And this will be a tremendous challenge for many EU countries from the newer member states. And again, the UK, I believe, will be a tremendous, tragic loss for Europe and for the UK if the European Union will be losing such an influential member. From strategic, from financial, cultural, historical, and also the balance of power culture that Britain has developed over time. So, but don't consider Europe out of the game. Europe will probably not become a global power in the definition of power that I was trying to refer to, but Europe will continue to be a global player. And if and when Europe and America will be working and acting together, there will be a formidable force that will be very difficult to cope with. If America and Europe will go on separate paths, Europe will be much weaker faster, but also America will become relatively faster, much weaker than it is today. So I believe the unity of the West is also paramount to the survival of the West as a dominant player around the world. The rules are tough. Thank you all for coming. I hope this was of interest. I will leave you my personal coordinates if you need to be in touch with me. If you want a reference to become a diplomat, I'm not that foregone in diplomacy. It was a privilege to be with you, and thank you for the host for inviting me, and for you, all of you, to taking the night to be together with me. Thank you so much.
If I could just thank Senator Geoana for a stimulating and also cautionary presentation. I'm sure, like me, you found it fascinating. I just forgot at the beginning to introduce myself. I'm actually the visiting Ion Ratsu Professor of Romanian Studies, which is why I'm standing next to Senator Geoana here. And just to reassure Senator Geoana, I remember going in 1993 to Romania to chair a conference about communist repression, and I was so severe in imposing the time limit on the speakers that one elderly gentleman got up, snatched the microphone from my hand and said, "Professor Delatant, you're worse than a Stalinist. We've just escaped communism and now you've come here." So there we are.
Thank you again. This is my private email address. I'll put it on this table. I don't have enough business cards for all of you, but this is here. Don't hesitate to call on me. I'm also chairman of the Aspen Institute in Romania. We have the best young leaders programs in Europe. We train youngsters from 14 countries, from the Adriatic across the Black to the Caspian Seas. We have a pretty strong presence also internationally. So you might be finding some internship or other interesting things to do with us. So I try to be not as Stalinistic as Dennis is trying to describe us, but to tell you that, and also something, a pitch at the end, which is not part of the conference, a sales pitch. We're trying to create between 3 leading universities in Bucharest, the engineering school, the business school, and school of government, a structural relationship with Georgetown. Because I believe, and we are proposing a tri-master degree in Bucharest, where engineers and people studying technology and business and economics, and also School of Government and Diplomacy, in the second year of their master degree, they should rotate faculty and students together with Georgetown faculty and students, just making sure that at the end of the day, your bright, intelligent capacities will not be only in one field, but to give the youngsters and the leaders of tomorrow the capacity to understand also the technological, also the business, and also the governmental constraints and opportunities for you to have a much broader look of the world and to be ready to buckle up and be successful in any situation that the world and your lives would be leading you into. So why not, when you'll be a little bit getting a little bit across the undergrad, I'm convinced that you'll be in the position also to choose Romania and Bucharest for studies abroad and exchange of faculty and students. And this is why I'm here, just to cement this beginning of cooperation between Georgetown and my country, Romania. Thank you so much.